shifting gears, now we're going to hear from an economist, and an economist that has formed one of the most influential economics analysis private companies that is active in many jurisdictions. Simon Bishop is very frequently appearing in these cases, and without further ado, if he could join me on the platform.
So, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be invited to participate in this 10-year anniversary, and having been through the same sort of landmark, I must say lots of congratulations. It's clearly been a success, but I think what a lot of people in this room will not appreciate is the hard work and some of the pain which is involved in going from year 0 to year 10, so congratulations. And also thank you for including me on this roster of experts. You know, I do feel a bit of an imposter, and in fact I'm reminded of the first time I spoke at a seminar with Richard Wish. He defined an expert as someone who flies in from overseas and use overhead transparencies, and I failed on both counts. Now obviously 10 years on, overhead transparencies have finally died, and now we're into PowerPoint presentations, but unfortunately I've failed on that basis as well. I don't have a PowerPoint. The title of my talk I'm actually going to change. It's sort of EC merger control, the good, bad and the ugly in the sort of last 5 years. And that was fine at the time I put forward this title. But when I started trying to think about this, trying to think of something good to say, I had to go back further in time. So this is actually going to be developments in European merger control in the last 10 years. And it's the good, the bad and the ugly. Now, as many as you will know, that European merger control is a relatively new creature. It was introduced sort of in 1990s, 25 years ago. And I think it had gave rise to two important trends in both European merger control, but then some of those trends also had impact on how we do competition analysis in other areas of European competition law. And I think the two trends are, first, it's about making the use of economic arguments explicit. And the second one is it's testing hypotheses derived from economic principles with reference to observed market evidence, what you as lawyers might call facts. So let me go through those 2 points in a bit more detail. Now, it should be clear that economic concepts are absolutely central and critical to the sensible application of competition law. Now, note, I'm not saying economists, I'm saying economics, and I'll come back to why I make that differential at the end, because I think some of the contributions of economists in recent years have actually had a detrimental effect, and I'll explain why. But the fact that economics is central should be pretty clear. When we think about the key concepts of competition law, we talk about competition. That's an economic concept. We talk about oligopoly. That's another economic concept. Barriers to entry, monopoly. All of these concepts are economic concepts. They're not legal concepts. They're not sociology ones or political. So economic concepts are at the heart of competition law, the application of competition law. And really, once one recognises that, we're left with a choice. We can either do economics implicitly, or we can do it explicitly. And I think prior to really the merger control, a lot of the economics was in there, in the reasoning of the courts and the legal judgments prior to 1990. It wasn't that explicit. And I think what the introduction of the merger regulation did was actually make, through the submissions of the parties and the responses of the Commission, to make these economic arguments much more explicit. And I think that made not only, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but the sort of a better application of the merger control, but I think it also just meant that a lot of merger control went way beyond just defining the relevant market, calculating market shares and adding up those of the merging parties and seeing whether it was a big number or not. So for me that was one important step forward. The second one here is is about testing, using observed market evidence to actually test some of these theories. Now, we all know there are numerous economic jokes, of which I'm very fond. If you laid all the economists end to end, they would never reach a conclusion. And if you ask 2 economists, you get 3 different answers. And this is, I think, an important point to understand about. Economists talk about economic theory, but we're not talking about economic theory in the way that physicists talk about theory. Physicists can posit a theory and they can test it under laboratory conditions to see whether it's true or not. In economics, we can't do that. We're dealing with humans, firms making their actions, choices, consumers making their choices. It's very hard to come up with laboratory conditions. And actually, when you think about it, economic theory is not really theory, it's models. And I've got a model and another economist will have their model. And so how do we decide whose model is a better representation of reality? Well, you need to have reference to evidence. And in particular, I would say, what we actually observe in the marketplace. So against that sort of bedrock, how have things gone since around about 2004? And I know that's not 10 years, that's 11 years, but bear with me, please. How have things gone? Well, I think the first thing, before we can sort of say whether things have got better or worse or terrible, we need to have an idea about what benchmark we're assessing good practical economics. And I would give 3 criteria for economic models which should be given credence. And if a model or economic submission doesn't meet any of the following criteria, I would suggest that it should be disregarded from the analysis. And the first criteria is it's got to reflect the key characteristics of competition in the market you're looking at. So I'll give you an example of where firms, I was an expert witness, and one of the issues was firms were bidding for TV rights. The expert on the other side came up with a model which proved his client's case, assuming a particular type of auction mechanism. Unfortunately, my client wasn't using that auction mechanism, he was using something completely different. So how can something which failed to capture something which is so central to how actual competition happens tell you anything about the real world? I would say absolutely nothing. The second principle of good practical economics is you've got to present hypotheses which can be tested against facts. If you come up with a theoretical possibility but no one can test it, well, we're just playing an academic game here, and that again you should be rejected. And the third one is any submission should be able to explain what we observe in the market today. If the models and the submissions can't explain how firms are competing today in an accurate way, it's not going to form a very good benchmark for determining how a merger is going to change competition. So, how have things gone? Well, the financial crisis should teach us all very, very hard messages that we should never expect things to keep getting better and better. But let me go through the good things first. I think there are two good developments in EU merger control. The first one is the introduction of what's known as a data room. And the European Commission now gives access to parties, merging parties, of all of the confidential economic evidence submitted by complainants. This is a really critical and important positive step because it allows the parties to really address whether what the economists for the complainants are saying really stacks up or not. And it's a really important development, and I think the European Commission should be, widely applauded for being the sort of first, certainly in my experience, to introduce this process. And then the second, and I'll put this on because I need to have more than one thing to say, which was good, but I have some issues here as well, but it's the creation of the Chief Economist team. The Chief Economist team was, when it was first established in around 2004, was set up as a checks and balances on the case team. It set itself aside from the case team and had its own independent view, and that worked brilliantly. I think unfortunately over time the chief economist team has tended to be co-opted back into the case team, and one of its original purposes as an internal check and balance on the case team has disappeared. So what about the bad? Well, I think I've got two bad things here. The first one is about the sort of hierarchy of evidence. We've really got sort of three broad categories of evidence. We've got what I would say is, the facts. What do we observe in the market? Prices, quantities, entry decisions of firms. The second one was we have consumer responses, either, making representations to the Commission or through surveys. And the third one are documents. Now, as a humble economist, I would say that the hierarchy of those three pieces of evidence ought to sort of vary from case to case. But in practice, more and more, documents are trumping everything else. So if the documents say something, doesn't matter what firms are actually doing in the marketplace, or what customers are actually doing, or what customers are actually saying, the Commission says the documents. And that seems to me an unwelcome trend in EC merger control. The second one is the increasing use of sophisticated economics. You say, really? Here's an economist saying we don't like an increasing use of sophisticated economics. Well, I have to caveat this, because what I mean by sophisticated economics, I'm using it in inverted commas, because actually a lot of these models which have been put forward are superficially complex. There's a lot of equations in there, and lawyers don't understand it, and I can write a long report with lots of tables and equations and go, and the answer is 17.53, and you go, oh, it must be right, or either it must be right or I don't understand it, so it must be wrong. Either of those are not good outcomes. Now, the real problem is that if sophisticated economics meant I'm going to spend more time and more effort trying to pick up all of the intricacies and complexities of real-world competition, then I'd be wholly in favour. But it's not. It's the opposite. And I'll give you a quotation from the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who was himself a brilliant mathematician as an undergraduate, so he's not afraid of mathematics. He says, too large a proportion of recent mathematical economics are mere concoctions as imprecise as the initial assumptions they rest on, which allow the author to lose sight of the complexities and interdependencies of the real world in a maze of pretentious and unhelpful symbols. I couldn't agree more. And I could give you a really concrete example of where a recent development, I think, has taken European merger control in totally the wrong direction. And I'm flabbergasted when I go to some of these ICN working groups and people are trying to teach some of these developing nations to adopt these principles. And the principles I'm talking about are the UPP, the upward pricing pressure. Now, a lot of you may know, this is put forward as you can do merger control, any horizontal merger you can assess by just knowing two things. You just need to know the diversion ratio between the two merging parties, and you need to know the margins of the sales. Sounds easy, sounds great. I've got the following problems with this. The first one is these models predict that every single horizontal merger, whether it's a 3-to-2 or a 99 to a 98 merger, will increase price. And when you start talking to business people about these UPP, you get varying responses to, can that be right, to much less polite responses. And again, they're quite right. And there's huge problems with this, because you only need to measure these two things. But actually measuring both diversion ratios and margins are extremely difficult. And you're also given this whole false sense of precision. The number comes out as 0.78 or whatever it is. But you've actually really just layered an imprecise measurement on top of another one to come up with a spurious number. But perhaps my most important criticism is the UPP analysis is detracting attention away from the real issue, which is trying to understand how competition works in the industry in which the merger is taking place. If you do the UPP, if you believe in the UPP analysis, it would be great for me. I would not need to be in London or Brussels. I could be on a beach in Thailand. Because all you need to do is just send me the data. You don't need to tell me what the industry is, or even what the name of the firms are. Just send me the data, and I'll plug it into my computer while I'm sipping a beer at lunchtime, and I'll send you back the answer. This Thai beach economics cannot be the way to do merger control. Now, some people would say, Bishop, he's off on one again, he's overstating this. Now, the UPP was originally put forward as a screening mechanism, as an alternative to defining the relevant market and working out whether an in-depth investigation was required. Now, I've got some problems with that, but if that's how it is used, fair enough. But the reality is, these UPP measures are now being used to predict price increases. And if you look at some particularly EU recent merger decisions on mobile, they will have their predictions of prices are based on a pretty simple UPP or a variant known as GUPPI. This is not, and the Commission believes in these estimates. That cannot be the right way to go forward. So let me come to the ugly. So we've gone through the good, the bad, and now we're at the ugly. And for me, I think, if the increasing use of so-called sophisticated economics just stopped there, then I would, I'd still have my little gripes, but I could stop. But I think the biggest problem is actually driving a gap between the economists and the non-economists involved in competition policy. Economics, as I said, should be absolutely central to the process. And it is. But economists also have to understand that they're operating within a legal framework. And they're talking to non-economists. They're talking to very intelligent people, but they're not economists. And it's not good news if the response to the economic debate leaves the target audience, which is my clients, the Commission, judges, cold and or perplexed. That is not a good development. And actually, I think that's where economics is going in EU merger control. And I quite often now hear Commission officials say, yes, Simon, I understand your argument, but that's the economic argument. I go, well, which part of the argument is not economics? And we're getting separated off into a component where it allows the economists to play in their sandpit and allows the lawyer adults to get on with the real world. Now, I don't think that that's a good development for good application of merger control. So I think what economists should be aiming for here is not complexity for complexity's sake, but rather clarity in the application of sound, well-established economic principles, firmly rooted and tested against observed market evidence. And I'll leave you again with one quotation from Keynes. He says, and I think we should genuinely aspire to this, if economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this spirited, truly spirited presentation. You would not know, but you're in a country where very recently we had a debate of our own about Keynes. And the debate was between the head of central bank and the now president before prime minister. And the president was offering his thoughts on sound monetary politics. And he is of the opinion that interest rates should be cut to level 0, and that the central bank is doing the worst thing to the Turkish economy by not doing that. And the Turkish central bank was trying to explain that actually there is not that kind of a correlation between inflation and interest rates, and that's not how you regulate economics in general as a central bank, also trying to explain that they're an independent body as much as one can be independent in the particular dynamics of our country right now. And at some stage, Keynes was being referred to, and certain members of our government have offered that books of Keynes or quotes by Keynes should not be welcomed anymore as he's so old. And I'm glad to hear that we're still putting our faith in Keynes, and there are some of us that are still doing that.